Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for our event, Rethinking Studies in Genocide, Atrocity, and Human Rights, a virtual panel discussion with GHRUP alumni. Today we are very pleased to welcome 4 graduates of the Institute's annual graduate level Genocide and Human Rights University program to discuss and explore questions related to their current work. For those who don't know about the Zorian Institute, my name is Megan Reed and I'm the Deputy Executive Director. And the Zorian Institute is a nonprofit research institute that was established in 1984. The Institute serves the cause of scholarship and public awareness relating to issues of universal human rights, genocide, and diaspora homeland relations through comparative and multidisciplinary research, publication, and education initiatives. Since we will be hearing from a few of our alumni today, and I know we have many graduates joining us today and listening in as well, we wanted to use this opportunity to share some news about one of our latest initiatives, the Promoting Equity, Tolerance, and Reconciliation Through Genocide Education program, taught by graduates of our GHRUP. And this program teaches high school students in the Greater Toronto Area here in Ontario, Canada, about the role of human rights in genocide prevention and about the impacts of genocide through firsthand testimonies from those who have experienced the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, in Canada's residential school system. We are hoping to expand this program in the coming years to reach a wider audience nationally and perhaps even internationally, and establish a teachers training program to better equip secondary school educators with the tools needed to teach such a heavy and critical subject. So if you are interested in becoming involved with this initiative, please do not hesitate to contact us. And my colleague Ali will be sharing our webpage in the chat to learn more about this program and other Zorian Institute activities. So a few logistical items before I give our moderator, course director, Professor Joyce Apsel, a proper introduction. If you have any questions, suggestions, feedback, or would like to engage in the discussion throughout today's session, we encourage you to use the raise your hand function on Zoom, and I will unmute you so you can engage in the discussion. This keeps it interactive and dynamic, but of course, you're also welcome to submit any questions you have in the Q&A chat box, and I can read these out loud for everyone. There will be a 20 to 30 minute Q&A session at the end of today's discussion to address some of these questions and engage in more discussion. If you have any questions specific to the Institute, please ask them in the chat box or send us an email to admin@genocidestudies.org. I would now like to welcome and introduce our moderator of today's discussion, Professor Joyce Apsel, the course director of the GHRUP. Professor Joyce Apsel is a Ph.D. J.D. clinical professor in the College of Arts and Sciences at New York University and president of the Institute for Study of Genocide. She's the author of Introducing Peace Museums, nominated for the 2017 Dayton Literary Peace Prize in Nonfiction. She is also the co-author with Amy Sidaro of Museums and Sites of Persuasion, Politics, Memory, and Human Rights, and co-editor with Ernesto Verdeja of Genocide Matters, Ongoing Issues and Emerging Perspectives. Professor Apsel is a recipient of the NYU Distinguished Teaching Award and of the student-nominated NYU Martin Luther King Jr. Teaching Award. Professor Apsel, we are so fortunate to have you moderating today's session, and thank you so much for joining us. I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Megan. And I want to thank Megan for all her work as Deputy Executive Director of Zorian, and Allison Reed as well, both of them for helping put this together. Hello, everybody. It's so nice to have so many of you here. And of course, this is central to GHRUP, creating dialogues, continuing the discussion after the end of the class. And of course, when I'm just going to say a few words about some central ideas of GHRUP. It is, of course, tragic that today, given the ongoing destruction going on in the Ukraine, the structural violence in other parts of the world, that we understand that the recurrence of atrocity is part and parcel of human history. in the beginnings of this course, when a number of people came together from the Zorian Institute in the early 2000s, this was a very innovative and continues to be innovative in the attempt to link both human wrongs and human rights, which we know, if you took the first session of the course, as I always say, are inextricably linked. So the importance of the material shifts in terms of some of the content. It began by being very event-based with the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, Rwanda. And it continues to look at these terrible tragedies, but it also expands with the way the genocide studies and atrocity studies has expanded to look at indigenous peoples, to look more and more at themes like gender and genocide, like destruction by attrition. And this year I'm going to be doing a session together on destruction by attrition, but with a Ukrainian scholar on how these two link with what's going on today. We will also be doing a session on the Uyghurs. So unfortunately, the targets continue, as we know, of targeted people, sometimes people who have been targeted before. Other themes that continue to be important are themes such as denial. The weakest part, we know, is prevention, but yet so very important. And we have a final session with 3 people looking at different aspects of prevention of the environment, which is also a newer section, as well as a section for the second time on museums and memories and the politics of those. So the course has and continues to evolve. And part of that evolution is you students and what you tell us we would like more of, or we would like to be included. Another, I think, very distinctive part of the course is the bringing in of specialists who bring their voice into the classroom and who many people engage with afterward. So the global scope, the interdisciplinarity, and the possibility of people who come from very different backgrounds in terms of countries, race, religion, histories, tensions, being allowed to be together and be in dialogue. And one of perhaps the most important outcomes of this course is to allow students who were raised in Armenia and Turkey, who were raised in Germany and Israel, who were raised in Russia and the Ukraine, to get to know each other, to speak to each other, and have the possibility to create not only new scholarship, but new links for repair, for recovery, for prevention, for resistance to denial. So I, as director, feel it's a great privilege to be part of this ongoing dialogue. And I'd like to thank so much Asia, Daniel, Lauren, and Anastasia for coming together and introducing to us their work, because we all know that the personal is political and the political is personal, and how important it is, and all too often how rarely it is, that we learn together, we speak together, we debate, and sometimes we disagree. Sometimes the professor's called out. That's okay. That's good. And so we want to continue that dialogue. So we very much look forward to hearing what each and every one of you have to say this evening.
Thank you so much. I'd now like to introduce our first panelist today. Anastasia Leshishin is a PhD student at McGill University in the Department of Political Science. She holds an MA in European and Russian Affairs from the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, and a BA in History, Political Science, and Classical Civilization from the University of Toronto. Her research interests include ongoing political and institutional reform processes in Ukraine, with a notable interest in the judicial sector. She was formerly a research associate at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta, in the division dedicated to the study of the Holodomor, the man-made famine in Soviet Ukraine from 1932 to 33. Anastasia's discussion title for today is Russia's War in Ukraine, Memory, Politics, and Violence Against Civilians. Anastasia, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to reconnect with the community at GHRUP and the Zoryan Institute, and I'm most grateful for the invitation to join today. I attended GHRUP in the summer of 2019 when I was working at the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium. And despite the dismal events that were under study during the 2 intensive weeks at the group program, I really left the course feeling fulfilled and motivated to pursue a path that would allow me to continue engaging with the kind of people and themes that I was exposed to in the course. And I have to say that it was because of GHRUP that I was finally prompted to take the leap and pursue doctoral studies. I'm so grateful for the encouragement of the faculty at GHRUP, and especially Dr. Apsel, and for the numerous meetings and consultations I had with the various members of the faculty after the course who offered guidance on how to navigate the sometimes daunting application process. I'm also, of course, very grateful to GHREC and especially the executive director, Marta Baziuk, who encouraged me to apply in the first place and providing me with the opportunity to take the 2 weeks to participate in the course. Now, one of the main projects in which I was involved with colleagues at GHREC was the development of an online photo directory of authenticated images from the Holodomor, the 1932-33 man-made famine in Soviet Ukraine. And it's on sort of the progress of the research for this photo directory that I presented on during the course. Now, the Holodomor photo directory was launched in 2020. Later, I'll share a link to the directory in the chat. And while I haven't engaged with much research on the photos since its launch, the project has certainly remained on my mind, and themes and considerations that informed its evolution continue to resurface. And this was especially the case with Russia's escalation of its war in Ukraine this past February. As someone who had spent a significant amount of time analyzing photos of atrocities previously committed on Ukrainian soil, this experience inevitably contextualizes how I have engaged with, interpreted, and responded to the extensive coverage, and notably the visuals of events that we are seeing on the grounds in Ukraine. Now, in my mind, this deluge of photos and videos documenting atrocities committed by the Russian soldiers against Ukrainian civilians really stood in stark contrast to the around 100 photos that document the events of the Holodomor 90 years earlier. So for a genocidal famine that killed 3.9 million people, there are 100 photos, only 100, that exist and offer a glimpse of the widespread starvation and suffering that was inflicted on the people of Soviet Ukraine through the ruthless policies of the Soviet authorities. Now, this is, of course, a testament to the massive effort on the part of Soviet authorities to conceal the famine and to deny its occurrence. Stalin was determined to show the world that collectivization was a success. He sold the grain expropriated from the starving population to finance his huge industrial projects. And it really was a risk to one's life to take photographs. And as any reference to hunger let alone material photographic evidence, was considered malicious anti-Soviet propaganda. Now, most of the photos were surreptitiously taken by businessmen or representatives of other governments who were on official assignment in the Soviet Union and who smuggled the photos upon their departure. Only one local resident of Soviet Ukraine, Nikolai Bokan, is known to have captured photos of his family suffering from famine. And I note that Nikolai was from the Chernihiv region, north of Kyiv, and the local Ukrainian Security Service archive, where the photos were initially found, recently fell under Russian bombardment in late March. While Nikolai Bokan's original photos remain as they were transferred to the archive in Kyiv, the significant damage to the archive leaves an inevitable gap in knowledge of the region's experience of famine and broader Soviet repressions against Ukrainians. Now, one of the main issues that engaged our team at GHRUP was the question of what the selection of photos that we were working with really demonstrated about the suffering endured from famine. What do photos of famine look like? What do we expect to see in the photographs that are said to document famine, right? And it's fair to say that for the most part, one might expect to see images of weak, emaciated, bloated bodies that are the physical result of the prolonged starvation. Yet these expectations are not really realized in the photos that exist of the Holodomor. The photos demonstrate extreme suffering. We see individuals lying on the streets, dead or nearly dying, but we see no one in the picture who could bear responsibility for their suffering. There's no tangible weapon that has inflicted the harm, nor could we have deduced the context from which the photos emerged if not for the inscriptions and writings of the photographers that have survived. So it's here that I want to show a small selection of photographs and transition to a discussion of contemporary coverage of Russia's war in Ukraine. So I will attempt to do this here. Let's see. Okay. Can you see these slides?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I'm trying to figure out how to put it into a better view. Whoops. Fit to window. Well, you can see them regardless, even if it's maybe a funny, yeah, okay. So I realize that one could find photos of war, famine, and suffering throughout the world captured in various periods of history that are comparable to those seen in photos of the Holodomor and the current war. And I don't mean to overstate the connection between these two events either. But as I mentioned before, my research on these archival photos has inevitably influenced my engagement with footage and coverage of the current war, and some parallels in imagery inevitably stood out. Second, the suffering the photos capture, both here in the Holodomor and in the current war in Ukraine, can really be seen as part of a long-standing legacy of Soviet and Russian imperialism, corresponding notions of Ukraine's inferior colonial status, and a determination of authorities in Moscow to deny the existence of Ukrainian sovereignty and a thriving political and cultural Ukrainian identity. And finally, I also find it especially interesting to consider how these photos have figured and will figure as evidence amid a vast array of other sources in efforts by academics, policymakers, and various courts to understand the dynamics at play, and with regards to the current war, to bring the perpetrators to justice. Now, although certain photos that are featured in the Holodomor photo directory were published in newspapers in the 1930s, we certainly can't compare their circulation to what we have seen with regards to recent photos from towns like Bucha and Irpin, and the impact these images had on international public awareness and opinion about the war in Ukraine, and the willingness of Western countries to increase their support for Ukraine. So here I'll go to the next slide. So in looking at the photos of the current war in Ukraine, and especially side by side with those from the Holodomor, it's striking how they emanate the consequences of violence and destruction, both in terms of the visibility of bodily harm and the extensive destruction of the surrounding landscape. Now, I had a timely opportunity in a recent class on comparative politics at McGill University to engage with work on collective violence. And I was inevitably led to think about the current events in Ukraine as I engaged with the material. So in particular, there is extensive literature on violence against civilians, and I'm going to paint really broad strokes here. But what we see in the literature is sort of a consensus that violence against civilians is often strategic and instrumental and not arbitrary, not unintended or distinct from the logics of war. There are extensive discussions about motives that drive belligerents to target civilians, considerations of the conditions in which violence against civilians is most likely, and ultimately questions about whether violence against civilians is effective towards the success of the belligerents' broader aims. There are also, of course, multiple classifications about different forms of violence, whether indirect or direct, lethal or non-lethal, and non-lethal would include instances of sexual violence, which we have seen extensively or heard about extensively in Ukraine at this time. Now, it's becoming ever more clear that the atrocities committed by Russian soldiers on the outskirts of Kyiv was not a breach of the norm, but rather a systemic form of behavior that has occurred throughout Ukraine in regions that were or remain under Russian occupation. But although the systemic extent of the violence against civilians is evident, it really remains unclear whether the brutal violence was commanded by the upper echelons of the Russian military or the Kremlin, or what motivations drove Russian soldiers to commit the atrocities they did. And there is, of course, extensive discussion about whether Russia's actions in Ukraine amount to genocide, which take all of these phenomena and patterns into considerations. But while the literature on violence against civilians discusses how ethnicity and nationalism correspond or facilitate dynamics of violence, it seems to me that Russia's war in Ukraine provides an opportunity to consider how the politics of memory can be linked with violence against civilians, how the politics of memory may create conditions that facilitate or abet violence against civilians, regardless of whether or not violence was officially sanctioned and encouraged by higher authorities. And this is a gap that I have found in the literature. I want to emphasize that I'm really only at the beginning of this this research, frankly, at the stage of the literature review. But it really is clear that Russia's war in Ukraine provides opportunities to consider these dynamics. And in particular, what is especially salient in this case is the prevalence of the memory of the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War in Russia. And there is much literature within the field of memory politics that looks at how issues related to the Second World War, especially in the last 8 or so years since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, has provided a significantly unifying element for sort of Russian identity building, Russian nation building. And a major current of these discussions and of this memory politics is this notion of victory. And I can't help but wonder how notions of victory, how a society, how an army, how a people whose identity is so crucially centered on this notion of victory, then deals with the kind of resistance that they see in Ukraine, and the opportunity or the potential for defeat, and what kind of actions they are willing to undertake in order to continue their narrative of victory that is, frankly, an existential issue to Russian identity. So I will sum things up here. I am grateful for this opportunity to reflect on past research, think about how it has evolved and inspired current and future considerations. And I look forward to hearing some questions and feedback from the participants and the audience.
Thank you, Anastasia. So much of what you have said resonates very much with themes, of course, from GHRUP. When we talk about famine and deprivation and destruction by attrition, and the lack of images, as you point out, of course, oftentimes the state entity calls this death by natural causes. And so think of the Great Chinese Famine, as well as the elimination of the record, of viewing the other. And even when the record, as you pointed out, even now in the Ukraine, when it's before our eyes, the politics and the rhetoric that go with that, have their own historical bias and their own politicalization. So these are really important themes. This theme of vulnerability of populations who before have been victimized or have become the other, and how that resonates once again in what you're calling ongoing violence. So you brought up violence studies, which is really, again, on this continuum of destruction. It's not like genocide is one place and war crimes are another place, that these are continuums. So thank you so much for that very important, albeit tragic, analysis of some of the images and some of the rhetoric and the politicalization of memory. Megan?
Yes, thank you so much. Okay, next up, we have Dr. Asia Darbinian. She is a postdoctoral scholar at the Martin Springer Institute in the Department of Comparative Cultural Studies at Northern Arizona University, where she offers courses on the history of the Holocaust and on women's experiences during genocide. She earned her Ph.D. in history at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University under the direction of Professor Taner Akcem. Her dissertation explores the Russian Empire's responses to the Armenian genocide and to the refugee crises at the Caucasus battlefront of World War I. Dr. Darbinian's research and teaching expertise stand at the intersection of Armenian history, the history of the Russian Empire, genocide, refugees, and the humanitarian interventions, with the focus on the agency and actions of refugees in addressing their suffering and plight. She is a recipient of multiple scholarships and grants, most recently the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative's Vartan Gregorian Scholarship to revise and expand her dissertation into a book manuscript. And before joining the Martin Springer Institute, Dr. Darbinian was a fellow in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University in Galloway, New Jersey, and the deputy director of the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute in Yerevan, Armenia. Dr. Darbinian will be joining the Strassler Center at Clark University as a visiting assistant professor for the 2022-2023 academic year. She will teach courses on the history of Armenia and the Armenian genocide, genocide and women, and the history of genocides. Dr. Darbinian's discussion title for today is Introducing the Russian Empire and the Armenian Refugees in the Caucasus to Armenian Genocide Studies. Asia, welcome.
Thank you for having me tonight and for such a generous introduction. And, it's really amazing to be back seeing the faces and just all the memories that come to me. It's, it leaves me speechless, but I will speak. And as you kindly mentioned, I have been teaching this past academic year at Martin Springer Institute in Northern Arizona University. And since Joyce mentioned at the very beginning the importance of gender and genocide, one of the courses that I taught this semester and was very popular among students was Women in Genocide. And their students were bringing their friends to my class to attend. so that they could, if it interested them, they could come back next year and take it. And I was like, yeah, if they are interested, probably they should come because I'm not here next year. So, but yeah, those are topics that are just really not only important in terms of scholarship to be studied, but they also interest the youth, the students who like to analyze and compare, and it helps them to understand the everyday life, the reality around them. So just complementing what you already said. But before I talk about my own work, I would like to begin with just my connection to Zorian Institute and to the summer program, the Genocide and Human Rights University program, because it was actually exactly 10 years ago, back in 2012, when I was a researcher at Armenian Genocide Museum Institute in Yerevan, Armenia. And I worked on my project on humanitarianism and Near East relief and genocide refugees. And in that May, I received the news that my application for Zorian Institute's Genocide and Human Rights summer program had been accepted. I was headed to Toronto in August of 2012, and yet not even realizing how important and life-changing that experience was going to be for me. The program introduced me to a number of extremely crucial topics. Every day from 9 to 5, we would be sitting in those really chilly, like brutally air-conditioned classrooms, discussing various cases of genocides and human rights violations with world-leading experts of the field. I got to meet amazing Doris Bergen and learn from her how to use images when teaching about genocide. Samuel Totten talked so passionately about the situation in Darfur and the importance of caring for those far away yet suffering. William Shabazz talked about international criminal and human rights law and the intricacies of genocide convention. Endless discussions with scholars, educators, activists, and my peers from around the globe. And it was invaluable experience. Plus, as Anastasia also mentioned, the encouraging and inspiring conversations with Joyce Apsel, with George Shrinian, with Greg Sarkisian really boosted my confidence. And I'm not exaggerating here. Right after that summer program, I returned to Yerevan and prepared my application package, the one with which I applied for the doctoral program at Stressler Center at Clark University. And the following August, I was already in Worcester, Massachusetts, pursuing my doctoral degree. I have stayed in touch with many of my peers from Zorian Institute, and we presented together at conferences, traveled together, shared findings, and so much more. And it is an ongoing process. For example, during this past year, when I was at Northern Arizona University, one of the first exceptional scholars there that I met was Professor Alex Alvarez. And he's from Zorian Institute's academic board of directors, and we became really good colleagues and friends there. So it is impossible to explain how significant the role of Genocide and Human Rights University program can be. But not to take too much of the time, I will now try also to speak a little bit about my own research. I will begin with sort of again trying to show the relevance of current day events and the more recent past to understanding the history and also the importance of certain nuances that sometimes we miss when we tend to have this tunnel vision when looking at certain topics. Following the 44-day war, or the Second Karabakh War between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and the Russian brokered ceasefire agreement signed in November 2020, President Aliyev of Azerbaijan hosted a victory parade in Baku in presence of special guest, President Erdogan of Turkey. Meanwhile, the Armenian refugees evacuating their villages in mile-long columns of cars and trucks, they lamented, "Why has Putin abandoned us?" And this was not the first time that Armenians felt like the Russian state had abandoned them. Over 100 years ago, Ottoman and Russian troops fought at the Caucasus battlefront of the First World War. The border between the two empires kept shifting, dependent on military developments, the advance or retreat of their troops. And when in summer 1915, the Russian troops retreated from some Eastern Turkish territories like Van, Mush, that they had occupied earlier, the Armenian residents of those regions felt that they had been deceived. Like in November 2020, the geopolitical interests of world and regional powers clashed with the humanitarian concerns and sentiments for the people experiencing the crisis. My research explores Russian Empire's responses to the Armenian genocide and this refugee crisis at the Caucasus front. It analyzes the efforts of imperial Russian authorities and local national organizations on behalf of over 200,000 men, women, children that lost their loved ones and fled their homes between 1914 to 1917. And most importantly, it sheds new light on experiences and perspectives of refugees in the Caucasus. So how is my work new or different from the existing scholarship on Armenian genocide? Well, firstly, there is robust literature on international responses to Armenian genocide. These works focus on the Middle East and on American, British, German, Scandinavian news coverage and relief committees. In contrast, both the situation in Transcaucasia, or as we call it these days, the South Caucasus, and Russian response to this crisis have prompted little or if any scholarship. Meanwhile, as I mentioned, 200,000 refugees from Ottoman Empire had reached the Caucasus by July, August 1915 because of the military developments on Caucasus front and the genocide orchestrated and systematically implemented by the Ottoman state against its Armenian subjects. So my work introduces Russian Empire to Armenian genocide studies as a key actor. It also contributes to key discussions in interdisciplinary research on modern humanitarianism, refugees, transnationality of the Caucasus. I use the term imperial humanitarianism to show the multi-layered and intertwined nature of humanitarianism in this period. And breaking with one-dimensional portrayal of welfare efforts, I show complex networks for assisting refugees. And Russia's role in the region must be interpreted in more nuanced, contingent manner, since there are still, to this day, a number of questions that remain unanswered about the policies and practices of Russian state towards the Armenians of the region. When it comes to the period of the genocide and war, one of those questions is, was this substantial relief effort during the genocide on behalf of Armenians humanitarianism? Drawing upon material from Armenian, Georgian, Russian archives, my research looks into these varying agendas and concerns of local, national, international charity and state actors and agencies. It measures what specifically made some of them humanitarian and others less so. It demonstrates that aid provided to the refugees during war and genocide was different from traditional Russian benevolence in its scope and scale. I argue that these responses were determined by a confluence of three elements: humanitarian sentiment, imperial colonization agendas, and war contingencies. I also show that because of the empire's complex structure, Russian treatment of Armenians was multi-layered, similar to its policies towards other ethnic religious groups of the empire. In other words, it was not Armenocentric, hence not just anti-Armenian. Next important question my work raises is, what did the Armenian refugees think? What was the vision of contemporary Armenian activists, refugee population regarding Russian Empire's approach to Armenians in the Caucasus, in eastern provinces of Ottoman Empire? Did they see the Tsar and his army as protectors of Armenians during this period? Was Russian treatment of Armenians, survivors of genocide and refugees of war, seen as humanitarian act? And when we look into the testimonies of the refugees that made it to the Caucasus, we see their varying experiences during the population movements and their nuanced understanding of the Turkish and Kurdish attacks on the way, of Russian victories and retreats, of migration, of flight and assistance. Refugees had contrasting stories about Russian soldiers and Cossacks' attitude towards Armenians. Some complained about Russian military's disrespectful, inhumane treatment, even about cases of outright violence, while others told stories of extraordinary efforts by soldiers to save them. For many years, Armenian genocide research has focused on such texts as official documents, international reactions to the events in the printed press, and foreign eyewitness testimonies. They aimed at proving the crime of genocide. By analyzing foreign sources, scholars largely neglected the voices of survivors. As we know, Turkish state's continuous denial of genocide has had its impact on academic research as well. And I mean, even the United States took over 100 years to officially recognize the Armenian genocide. As historian and my colleague Khachik Muradian has explained, even when language was not an obstacle, scholars focused on Ottoman and Western sources. They avoided Armenian documents and accounts so as not to be accused of using tainted, biased, or manipulated material. Hence, those who actually went through the hardships of forced displacement, attacks on their houses and families, rape, abduction, forced conversion, starvation, epidemics, they were marginalized and their words were considered less worthy for scholarly analysis. Consequently, thousands of testimonies of survivors, as well as memoirs and diaries, remained in archives scattered all over the world, in one historian's words, gathering dust on the shelves. What I do in my research is I uncover those accounts and share their stories. And what the testimonies of refugees tell us is that for some, the Cossacks and Russian soldiers were just as violent and dangerous as Kurdish gangs and Turkish perpetrators. For others, they were saviors, the only way out of that misery. For some, Caucasus was safe haven, shelter to recover, befitting. For others, a hostile, unwelcoming place, threatened by epidemics, imminent death. For many refugees, the exodus to the Caucasus was not a choice, but a forced solution. They fled their homes to stay alive, but also to be able to return when given a chance and reconstruct their homes back in their homeland. So examining their stories allows us to portray a more nuanced picture of Armenian genocide refugees in contrast to the homogeneous, voiceless, faceless waves of people described in most of the reports prepared by relief organizations or governmental agencies. To better understand the condition and plight of refugees, and this goes for all cases of genocide, we need to attend to their experiences, perspectives, and needs. And I will stop here, and I look forward to any questions and to the other presentations. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Asia. There's a lot here. It's fantastic. And I think this again follows up with the a new way in which we're trying to deconstruct these homogenized notions of refugees, of perpetrators, and look at varied sources, which is so important, obviously, the voices that you are looking at, and the range of experiences that people have, and what the implications of those are. One can think, for example, of the fact that oftentimes even accounting in terms of numbers becomes so distorted because, in fact, refugees may stop one place and then go on and on and on. Darfur was a great example of that, populations over and over again. And so I think you've brought and really made it so clear all the work that needs to be done, and that part of which you're doing on this, this idea of rethinking, reevaluating, and giving voice to the politics of humanitarianism and the diversity of experiences. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, our next presenter is Daniel Gonzalez Stier. He is a professor of human rights and guarantees at the University of Buenos Aires and a professor of litigation skills at the National University of Lomas de Zamora in Argentina. He is a magistrate as public defender on criminal law in Buenos Aires and a litigation skills trainer at the Instituto Estudios Comparados en Ciencias Penales y Social, Asociación de Magistrados y Funcionarios de la República Argentina. Last week, he received his master's degree. That's new news, so congratulations. And Professor Gonzalez Stier is also a podcaster on Dosis Derecho, an educational podcast. His discussion is titled The Prevention of Genocide, a Perspective from International Criminal Law.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you. I'm really honored to be here today. It's a pleasure to me to present my work before these colleagues and before Joyce and Megan. When I was at the Sorian Institute in 2019, I was starting my research for my master's degree, and I start this research thinking about criminal law. But when I was at the Sorian Institute, I could saw the genocide from different perspectives, not only criminal law, sociological perspective, historical perspectives too. And I've been there with people from different cultures and from cultures who suffered different genocides. And I understand that maybe the criminal law, specifically international criminal law, is not enough to understand the complex of the genocide phenomenon. And when we speak about genocide or other human rights violations from the international criminal law perspective, we take the law as a tool to punish the perpetrators of genocide or human rights violations. But I discovered throughout my research that maybe the criminal law, specifically international criminal law, could be used as a way to prevent. And usually when we talk about prevention from international criminal law, we think in the punishment as a tool of deterrence for future perpetrators. But I don't believe in that. There are a lot of professionals who wrote about it, and I really don't think that a genocide perpetrator could be thinking in a possible conviction or punishment when he or she decides to start a genocide. But when we look at the Genocide Convention, there are some different legal points of view before a genocide that could be seen as tools of prevention. And I focus my research on the attempt to commit genocide. There is a point between the idea of committing genocide, the intent of commit genocide and the effective commission of a genocide, which is the attempt. And there is a technical difficulty to determine when does an attempt start, because the main issue of the definition, legal definition of genocide, is the intent. So the intent of commit genocide is with the perpetrator since the origin of the idea of the genocide. And I've been working on how to establish the start of an intent before the effective commission of a genocide. And this could be important from a perspective for criminal law. My concern, my original concern was how to legally define this attempt to commit genocide. But finally, I found that it could be a tool for international community as an early warning to prevent genocide. And this is the point I would like to talk about today. It's very important to me to talk about it here because it was at Sorian Institute when I realized the complexity of this idea and the possibility of use the criminal law as a way to prevent. To define the start of an attempt to commit genocide, I work at the first time with other legal tools, but it's very difficult to determine it because, as I said, of the intent as the main element of the genocide. So I took tools from another disciplines, specifically, sorry about my English, from the sociology. And I found ideas like the Stanton idea or Daniel Feuerstein idea of the different steps to commit a genocide. And when we look at the different steps, there are some of them that usually lives with us every day as humans. Unfortunately, we discriminate other people all the time, or we are discriminated by other people all the time. So the first step, the discrimination, in Feuerstein words, the construction of a negative otherness, could not be maybe legally defined, even when the sociologists can decide when there is a construction of a negative otherness. From the legal point of view, it's very difficult to say, well, there is a start of a genocide because the discrimination or the bullying, it's something that we have in the whole world in different societies. But the next step or stage in a genocide process, in words of Feuerstein, is the harassment. And the harassment we can divide in two: the physical harassment and the legal harassment. The physical harassment, it's the physical attitude against the otherness, the group discriminated or oppressed. And sometimes, usually, this physical harassment is not a clear tool to define the transit to a genocide, but I found that if a state gets into the legal harassment, when a state takes law as a tool to discriminate or to oppress a group or to make them impossible to access to certain fundamental rights, there is an objective point of view that we can define as a clear starting point of an attempt to commit a genocide. So we have discrimination and we have physical harassment, but when we have a law that says this group specifically can't access to some fundamental rights, there we have a definition of the state of this intent to suppress this population or this group rights, and also to when we combine this this law with the discrimination and the physical harassment, I think we have a clear way to understand that this state is going to commit a genocide. So if we take this point, the legal harassment, as a starting point of an attempt to commit genocide, there could be an intervention of criminal law, international criminal law, before the effective commission of a genocide. And even when this is difficult to punish, because genocide itself is difficult to punish, we don't have most of the genocide committed throughout the history haven't been punished in international criminal law. So if we don't have the punishment of the effective committed genocide, it's very difficult to think in the punishment of an attempt to commit genocide. But if we use the tools of international criminal law from an objective perspective, and we say when we have discrimination, physical harassment, and legal harassment to a determined group, we can use this tool of international criminal law as an early warning to the international community. So international community could use the idea of attempt to commit genocide from an objective starting point to act in a particular case of a genocidal process that is not concluded. I think this is important because usually when the international community starts an intervention to prevent genocide, there are some difficulties. The first is usually when the intervention is to prevent the genocide is ongoing. So we have, from a legal point of view, an effective commission of a genocide when the international community starts its intervention. But if we have this intervention before the effective concluding of the genocide, the genocide itself, the prevention could be effectively a prevention and not a reparation for a genocide in progress. So this is the first thing I think is interesting to use the attempt to commit a genocide as a way to prevent. And the second one is that usually the main power states in the world are suspected to use the prevention of genocide, the intervention in a prevention of genocide, for political or geopolitical objectives. So if we have an objective starting point when the genocide is not concluded, but legally we can say here we are in a genocide process, in a, as I said, a starting point, an attempt to commit genocide, there are objective foundations for the intervention, and it's politically less I don't have the word, sorry. Oh, sorry. Polemic. That's the word. It's less polemic for the international community if we have an objective starting point for intervention. So these are the main points of my research. And I think it could be interesting not just to define the attempt to commit genocide that is in the Genocide Convention, but we have not developed of the legal definition, of the legal extension of that definition, but to avoid suspects about illegal intervention of the international community.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Again, looking at following up on many of the issues we talk about in the class in terms of omission and commission, impunity, as you point out, and whether or not it stages, or whether there is our start question of intent, or whether there is more fluidity and ongoing processes, and whether or not you use the word polemic, perhaps I think you're trying to address the politics
Of course.
clearly of the impunity which recurs over and over again. Just a few of the many, many really important issues that you're raising in your research of combining sociological analysis and international criminal law. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, our next presenter is Lauren Grant. She is an advocate and researcher across the fields of human rights, humanitarian assistance and protection, peace building, and international development. She holds a BA in Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies, through which she created an interdisciplinary liberal studies specialization that she titled Deconstructions of Institutionalized Oppressions. Lauren also holds an MA in Human Rights from the Legal Studies Department of Central European University and is currently pursuing a Master's of Science in Violence, Conflict and Development at SOAS, University of London, where her research examines the nexus between climate change, forced migration, underdevelopment, the socioeconomic and cultural rights and livelihood of Indigenous communities, colonialism, genocide, and legal violence. Lauren serves as the Director of Field Research at Earth Refuge, the planet's first legal think tank dedicated to climate migrants, where she coordinates research on climate migration across the globe. She recently launched the upcoming and world's first international school on climate migration, a 5-week course that brings together scholars and practitioners to unpack the challenges of problematizing and responding to climate migration in the 21st century. Lauren, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you, everyone. It's been so interesting. It's funny to shift gears back into genocide studies mentality. I mean, it really is a special type of academic engagement, I suppose. I mean, even violence studies, I don't think comes quite as close to genocide studies in the way I would have expected. So I will switch gears a little bit because I do have a PowerPoint, and I do feel like I'll give a little warning that in some sense, I feel my presentation's probably coming out of left field in approaching genocide studies. So hopefully it will still pique some interest. So I'll get my screen shared here. And then I also, of course, just want to say, I think I'm probably the most recent graduate of the Genocide Human Rights University Studies program at Zorian. This past summer, I was delighted to participate in it. And I'll be very brief in basically just saying that, like my peers here on the panel, I think it was an incredibly life-changing experience. And I think one of the things that I just didn't expect going into it was to learn so much from my colleagues. I don't think I've ever had a group of colleagues that I've learned so much from, of course, in addition to the astounding visiting faculty. But I have to say, after, I guess, 5 universities at this point, I can never stop studying, and I promise I'm coming for a PhD at some point, but that it's probably the best academic experience I've ever had in my life. So really astounding job to the Institute and to Joyce, of course, for leading such a fantastic group of students and discussions. And yeah, so hopefully you can see my screen. Okay, so we'll see how this goes. So I'm going to chat about the genocidal coloniality of climate-induced displacement, rethinking accountability and legal protection in an era of crisis. It's a very big title, as you can tell. It's already contentious, which I love, and I'd be happy to take the criticism and the thoughts on this, of course, following in the Q&A. But we'll jump in for now. So let's see if my thing will allow me. Yeah. How do I go back? Oh. Okay. Not sure how to. There we go. Sorry. Share screen is like never an easy feat. So essentially, I'm going to run through just kind of an overview of what is climate-induced displacement. I know it's a new topic to a lot of people out there. It's definitely a burgeoning and rapidly emerging topic, at least I hope. It will continue to be in coming years. So I'll talk firstly about this and then kind of the key distinction within the field between rapid and slow onset climatic impacts and what this means for decisions to move or stay in the wake of these impacts. And then I will point to the legal vacuum that exists, which is really key, that essentially persons who are displaced related to the impacts of climate change do not have legal protection in the case that they cross an international border. So this notion of climate refugees is, from a legal perspective, in a way, a bit of a fallacy, which is something we're hoping to change at Earth Refuge as a legal think tank in the work that we do. And then I will look at the few examples, which I imagine you will all find quite interesting, in which protection actually was afforded, which all kind of resemble genocide by attrition in several different ways. And then kind of go into the links of coloniality. So again, as we were just talking about kind of the fluidity and ongoing processes, Nudlova Gatcheni wrote in 2015 The Genealogies of Coloniality. This is just half of his title, but I just love that phrase. It's really stuck within my research this past year. So I'll kind of take a look at this and then consider how we might take decolonial approaches to climate justice, and all of this again from a kind of international prevention and protection in particular lens. As a socio-legal scholar, I have to dabble into the legal side of things, of course. So to paint a bit of a picture, from 2008 to 2020, we've seen just shy of 25 million people displaced each year, with almost 90% of those displacements actually occurring related to extreme weather events or climatic factors, which actually amounts to 67,000 displacements per day. And in 2001, these type of displacements due to disasters and extreme weather events and other climatic factors zipped past conflict as the leading driver of displacement. And ever since, essentially individuals have been 4 times more likely to be displaced related to climatic events. Of course, there are interactions between conflict and climate change, which both can compound and force displacement. I've put this link here. I'll put it in the chat as well. I don't think I have time to open it, but International Crisis Group has this wonderful kind of interactive map in which you can see these overlaps as you kind of surf through it, of essentially the fact that half of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world are also very prone to conflict, with many of these being on the African continent. So of course, the big recurring theme, as we'll see in the graphs in the next couple slides, are that the low-income countries in the world, so often the poorest with the most limited resources, often also what we would call so-called post-colonial countries, are those who are least responsible for global greenhouse gas emissions and the climate crisis, but are also hit worst and first by the impacts of the climate crisis, with forced migration being a big secondary impact. So here we have a map from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, which I highlight is specific to internal displacement, not cross-border displacement. This is important, however, because the majority of people who have been displaced related to climate impacts and who will be displaced within their borders, which is really important, contrary to kind of popular myths around climate migration, of this massive influx of refugees coming into Western industrialized nations. No, not quite at all the case. The orange on this map represents displacement internally by conflicts, and the blue represents by disasters. And then, as we can see, obviously, these disaster-related displacements are outnumbering conflict and violence-induced displacements, with weather-related events accounting for the majority of this, storms and floods and cyclones being the biggest contributors, and drought to a lesser extent, though kind of increasingly becoming a bigger driver of displacement. Here, this is just a map from South Asia from 2016 research, which I just wanted to highlight. I mean, when we're talking about these extreme events, in China, the Yangtze River floods in 2016 alone caused near 2 million people to be displaced. In the Philippines, 2 different floods amounting to almost 6 million displacements within the same year. India, 1.6 million. So really, we're talking about a lot of people, even in given short time frames. I bring this map up as well because this speaks to cross-border displacement. It's very hard to find data on cross-border displacement. The only reason I think that we have such strong data for internal displacement is really because of the IDMC and its mission to make sure that that's produced. But this is a map that indicates essentially that when people do move across borders, as I was saying before, they often move within their regions. So it's, again, not, you do see many maps in which you have the United States and Europe and all the arrows are pointing there, and this is really very much a myth in the climate migration literature. So some kind of alarming predictions that are often spoken about, the leading ones really coming from the World Bank's groundswell research, which they've done 2 reports on in 2018 and 2021, that 143 million people will be displaced by 2050 across these 3 regions, and that up to 216 million globally. Christian Aid, on the other hand, predicts that up to 1 billion people could be displaced by 2050, which would be 1/10 of the global population at that time. I put all of these numbers here to give you an idea that just like in genocide studies, we have to be cautious or have caution about how we approach the numbers. But I think there's ample reason to believe, based off the fact that so many people are already moving, that there is need to respond to and take seriously this issue, and the fact that it will kind of only continue to increase in coming decades. So I'll just chat a bit about the rapid and slow onset distinction. I think any lecture on climate migration wouldn't be sufficient without it. So here you have, the rough idea of the kind of key distinctions between the two. Is that rapid onset climatic events are typically seen as a little bit more straightforward. They're kind of single, discrete events with clearly identifiable beginnings or ends, and they often take place over a matter of days or even hours, usually on more local or national scales. They can be meteorological or geophysical, and then slow onset are a little bit more difficult. Much like genocide, again, if we want to draw a comparative linkage, because they have this kind of slow process in which they evolve. And it makes it really difficult to distinguish forcible displacement versus voluntary displacement from a legal perspective in particular. So for example, if a community in the Sahel is experiencing increasing levels of drought, the decision to move to another area in a way is a little bit arguably more flexible, more up to their discretion than if a cyclone hits and your home is destroyed and you must kind of up and move immediately. So I'll predominantly focus on slow onset climatic impacts. Most scholars in this sector do, I think because it's a lot more contentious. But essentially want to highlight, this is also from IDMC, 4 main ways in which slow onset displacement comes about. So essentially, they can erode the capacity of ecosystems to provide critical services that are necessary for survival, including food and water and energy production. And they can directly lead to food insecurity or exacerbate situations of food insecurity or living conditions that are not to an adequate standard of living. And of course be harmful to those who are dependent on environmentally based livelihoods like agriculture and pastoralism. And again, most of the regions that are most vulnerable to climate impacts are reliant on agriculture for their subsistence and for their income generation. So the regions with the highest vulnerability to undernutrition are often also the areas where yield losses related to climate change are predicted to be relatively high, which further increases the vulnerability of these populations to insecurity. Further slow onset events can actually turn in or prompt rapid onset events as well. So there's this kind of feedback loop going on between these two. And in particular, if responses aren't adequately provided, such as disaster risk reduction or management in the aftermath of a disaster, this can also prompt further displacement or worsen what might have not had been such kind of catastrophic displacement. And then I think the fourth point is probably the most opposite when it comes to slow onset events, which is that they exacerbate and amplify other concerns, which is where conflict and genocide most definitely come into play. So there's a lot of contentious debate around the causality of climate change and conflict. People definitely take different sides. There's often argument that Darfur would be the first kind of example of a climate conflict, though that's definitely highly debated. But essentially, one very important thing that came out of the fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was an acknowledgement that while climate change might not necessarily cause conflict, it has the capacity to amplify stresses that diminish social cohesion and fuel tensions that can spur violent conflict or worsen violent conflict, that importantly could lead to persecution-driven human mobility, which we'll talk about in a sec with the legal questions as well. So this is one of the more simplified versions, I would say, of the kind of nexus at play. So the logic behind this graphic here is the questions around the mobility or immobility decisions. What factors does somebody assess when determining whether or not they have to move or they can stay in the wake of, in particular, slow onset climatic impacts? So naturally, they're assessing kind of their adaptive capacity. There are a lot of economists that take a swing at determining the approaches that might be taken in strictly economic terms. Sociologists will often talk about the social networks that potential refugees would have or IDPs would have should they flee. In terms of support, they might consider kind of their social position within a given society, if they're likely to receive support, and the related political position. And also, of course, the cultural position, which is especially important for Indigenous communities, as my work looks at. Also very important in this is that it's not necessarily just up to the individual and these factors as they affect them, but everything is also, in a sense, of course, filtered through the state. So, of course, it's the state that's responsible to engage in the policy-driven practices around climate change adaptation and mitigation in the first instance, and then to facilitate disaster risk reduction and management following a disaster. So again, kind of at the mercy of the interests of the state, but also equally important when we think about the regions that are vulnerable, the capacity of the state. So it might not be that the state is uninterested in being responsive in the aftermath of a disaster or even in preventing it in the first instance, but it could also be that that the state doesn't have the financial resources or isn't politically well situated to be able to obtain these from the international community. So I have a time check and I have a lot more to say, so I'll try to be quick. I'm going to skip through this one and essentially chat about the legal vacuum very quickly. Essentially, the refugee definition, legally speaking, doesn't apply to persons who are displaced related to climate impacts who cross borders. And this is for three main reasons. Firstly, that they have to cross an international border. And as I mentioned, most people who are displaced related to these impacts do not. Second, persecution. Climate change is often not seen as equated with persecution in terms of this definition, or actually any of the definitions under any international legal framework, which is interesting. There are a lot of scholars out there who argue for the extension of the scope of protection in the definition, which is loosely defined, of course. In fact, refugee law often borrows from the international criminal laws kind of understanding of persecution. It doesn't actually have its own kind of predetermined one. But essentially, with there being no kind of clear actor who's responsible for perpetrating, if you will, the climate crisis, which is kind of what, if I get a minute here, I'm hoping to kind of get to in this discussion and in my research in the future. And then the other piece is the convention grounds. So it's not just that the persecution, can't be attributable to climate impacts, but it's also that there's this kind of notion that climate change is an indiscriminate phenomena. But I would argue that climate change is indiscriminately discriminate because of those social, economic, political, and cultural factors, all exacerbated by the environmental ones that we were just chatting about. I'll move forward from here, see what else I can fit in. I think you guys will like this slide, so let's try this one. So essentially there are very few exceptions, very, very, very few exceptions in which refugee label and definition and hence protection has been applicable to people who are displaced related to climate impacts. And every single one of these scenarios is reflective of kind of the basic tenets of genocide by attrition. The idea of the state consciously withholding or obstructing assistance to punish or marginalize a particular group. This was actually endorsed by in the Bellagio deliberations and by the UNHCR in 2009, which is probably the most progressive the UNHCR has ever been on the topic. And then further kind of government policies that are targeting particular groups that are reliant on agriculture for survival. We could talk about Darfur in this context as well. The government inducing famine by destroying crops or poisoning water or contributing to environmental destruction through pollution. The government inducing famine as well. There was a case in Nigeria in which the African Commission pointed this out in a report, essentially arguing that refugee protection was then required in this situation. The list can go on. I'll keep going. Let's see what else I can fit in here really quick. I think probably the main tenet of what I'm trying to get at is Article 2C of the Genocide Convention. This idea of kind of a necropolitical, which I choose this word because it's more cautious than that of genocide for the lawyers out there, but this kind of necropolitical global relation in which essentially if we think about the coloniality of, and I'll just zip through this very quick, but if we think about the coloniality of climate change, who's responsible for global greenhouse gas emissions since the Industrial Revolution, and then if we think about the coloniality of underdevelopment, this kind of the development of the global north, the industrialized nations on the backs and at the expense of the underdevelopment of the global south, which go hand in hand, of course, in producing those emissions that have led to the warming of our planet. And we think about the coloniality of kind of modern cartographies and the global Westphalian system and the nation state system and the border regime and all of this kind of coming together. Then I think there's this big question, which is, you know, what do we do with these populations who are rendered without rights, without protection, without a place within the legal framework to seek those, kind of in the middle of all of this, at the expense of all of this. And I think this is part of the reason why my brain always jumps to the climate crisis as being, sorry, I made way too many slides. I think this is one of the reasons that my brain always jumps to the climate crisis as being this kind of infliction of conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction, which again, I know is a very contentious leap to make, especially for the legal scholars in the genocide studies field. But I'm curious, and most likely will spend my PhD research kind of trying to examine, even finding a case study. Of course, this has to be narrowed immensely, but trying to examine this link of the possibility of using this clause to understand how all of these pieces kind of come together through a genealogy of coloniality kind of interconnected web. So I will stop speaking there. Thanks for your patience with me for going over as well.
Wow, thank you so much, Lauren. So much here. I really think this is something you could really pursue. And I think that what we have seen in violence studies and genocide studies, you picked up the term fluidity, is that these are all interconnected. And I think it would just be a powerful lens to use in this way. I think we're well over, but again, the way in which you are connecting the fact that we see in our course, Genocide and Human Rights as well, is this lag for what the reality is, and this forgetting, for example, of coloniality, with how people today are affected and are going to be continued to be affected by these processes. One thing's clear that connects to genocide from what you've said is after what appears to be the height of violence, the violence continues. And that's really one of the nutshell points of what you have brought out here. Thank you all very, very much. You've taught me once again. I love learning. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And now we want to open it up to questions, but I also wanted to give our presenters the opportunity to ask each other questions or give feedback or comments on each other's presentations. We do have a few questions in the Q&A, and if you do have any questions, if you're one of the attendees and you have a question and you want to raise your hand, you can do that too, and I can unmute you. But first, yeah, do any of our speakers have any questions or comments? Okay, great. Well, if you think of any, feel free to ask. I'll go to our first question in the Q&A. This is for Anastasia. After the war this year, I've seen a lot of online discussion about how the Holodomor is an anti-communist propaganda, mainly by left-wing intellectuals. How do we deal with this kind of denialism and argue about intent in the case of the famine in Ukraine?
Thank you for the question. I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, as I imagine many of the attendees know, the famine was denied for decades, right from the outset, and certainly over the years, denial took on various strategies and manifestations, and certainly issues with regards to famine denial are ramping up at the outset of the war. In terms of how to deal with it or how to argue against it, I think it's not so much a matter of arguing against it, but familiarizing oneself with scholarship on the famine, and I'm not sure if anybody else wants to sort of chip in here, but I do think it's a far more constructive exercise to engage in ongoing research and new developments on research on the Holodomor than to engage with really distracting and malicious efforts to detract and deny from the famine and its causes and its ongoing legacies.
Thank you so much. Any other questions or comments from the attendees or the participants? Joyce?
Lauren, one of the things that struck me in your presentation and strikes me when Alex Alvarez and other people do it is we hear such overwhelming numbers and so many statistics in talking about the impact, the ongoing impact of environment and refugees. And how can one help educate people about this without them just saying enough? I mean, we see this, Anastasia, to be perfectly honest, with people on the war in Ukraine. Enough. I've seen too much. So I guess this is for everyone. This is a real dilemma.
It is. I mean, I agree. Like, I think what you just said at the end is, yeah. I mean, I suppose all of us in genocide, violence studies, etc., refugee studies probably get used to the kind of depressingly large numbers and to coping with them, and maybe they're fuel to our fire to keep, finding a way to advocate and to research and to use that research as advocacy. I definitely feel that way. I think, I don't know, it seems to me that there's, it's always going to be frightening. There's always going to be something frightening out there to learn about what's happening or what's going to happen to large numbers of people, I suppose. Um, I think also probably a common mentality to this sector or related sectors would be that, I don't know, it's like I'd rather know than not know, right? So that you can then mobilize and do what you can do. I think another thing, if I can just add, I've founded this climate migration school, which hasn't started yet. And if anyone's interested to attend, please send me an email. I can drop my email in the chat as well. It will begin in a couple of weeks. But I founded this school because my spiel is essentially that if there was a master's that existed in climate migration at the moment, I would be in it. But it doesn't. And so I'm studying violence, conflict, and development and focusing predominantly on climate migration through those lenses. And I have quite an interdisciplinary background, so I'm just kind of adding to the pile of lenses to explore it through. But I'm just astounded to see the silence around the issue in academia. There's more literature than I expected there to be, but there's practically no teaching on the topic. And so I don't know, maybe the numbers in a way startle people awake to understand. I mean, I don't know, I'm quite astounded to see I've received so many applications for people coming to this school. I will also, because I'm excited about it, add that I've had Tendai Achume, the UN Special Rapporteur on Racism, Xenophobia, Racial Intolerance, apply to study at the school, and just I mean, several professors. It started out as a postgraduate initiative and has turned into a substantial handful of PhD researchers and professors, which to me says that everyone's looking for this kind of outlet and space, and maybe startling them with the scary numbers is a good way to get them to show up and to engage with the topic. But yeah, I suppose it's motivation as far as I see it. But I imagine that my colleagues have thoughts on this as well.
Thank you. I'm thinking of our former director, Roger Smith, who talks about moving in and moving out as a way in which to cope, whether you're doing it in a court or in a classroom with these atrocities. But given also social media, people are just simply inundated and trying to figure out ways in which to effectively engage without sanitizing is really difficult.
We do have another question in the Q&A here. So given the influence, resources, and ability to mobilize people that many religious institutions and organizations have, what role do you think they can play in genocide and climate relief, prevention, or mitigation? Does anyone want to take this one? Lauren, did you want to say something on it?
I can, but I feel like I've been speaking a lot. If somebody else wanted to say something, yeah, I think it's a great question. I suppose if the question is individuals, I think that's always a challenging question. The question of an individual in the face of climate change is a really terrifying thing. I suppose the same would be true of the question of what an individual can do in the wake or the face of genocide as well, or any other kind of daunting atrocity facing collective groups of, mass collective groups of people. I suppose, again, raising awareness, the fact that the issue is of climate migration is barely on the agenda, and climate change is also kind of, slowly coming more and more into the mainstream consciousness. And the way I see climate change in particular fitting into into academic circles is it's always this kind of sideline discussion. Maybe you get one sub lecture that will examine the climate change link to whatever the topic may be that you're looking at. But I find that there's I don't know, I think Joyce's question before is quite accurate to this, that there's a lot of fear and overwhelm, so there's kind of a retreat from it, I suppose. But I think it's happening. So I think acknowledging it, I suppose, if you're keen to seek the truth and to strive for that and to work from that, it's always going to be difficult, but I suppose that's important. I imagine that surely one of my fellow panelists can take a swig at this with respect to the genocide piece.
I would like to say a couple of words. Yeah, totally agree with especially what you said about how terrifying it can be to imagine a person facing any of these crises and trying to play a role, whether it is in preventing or helping, even during, right? But if the question is about what organizations, and here it is like particularly addressing the religious institutions can do, I feel like one of the, probably that's because I'm speaking as an educator, but one of the most important things about preventing genocides and similar violences is to learn about the other. And when it comes to religious institutions, I think it would be really wonderful if all these different institutions, agencies, peoples give each other opportunities to know each other better. Because once you know who your neighbor is, that neighbor becomes more acceptable, and then tolerable, and then lovable, and then a friend. It's not always like that. There may be problems with those neighbors, but I think it begins with knowing them, giving them a chance to speak their story. And it starts with schools, but it goes all the way to political institutions, international organizations, and why not religious institutions, that if they attempt to be more open and know about each other and learn about each other, probably it will be easier to prevent hatred, incitement of hatred, and those are usually the first steps towards any kind of escalation, which leads to dehumanization. And if you know someone, it's more difficult to dehumanize them.
Joyce, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I just was someone in the chat, Alan Whitehorn is talking about implications of serial offenders. Again, I think we have to be very, very careful about essentializing countries and peoples. When we look at, yes, repeated patterns, and Anastasia certainly talked about that, Asia talked about that. And we see those patterns recur in different times, but they aren't exactly the same people. So again, we don't want to do in fact what is often done, which is to essentialize, otherize, and then target groups of people, and then flip it as serial offenders. There is a lot written that way. But I think, again, one of the hopes is, for example, with Lauren, with the environment, is that these different areas of study, like Danielle's sociology and law, can cross-pollinate with each other and learn from each other, so that we really try to avoid the old rhetoric the evil, good and evil rhetoric, because in fact, the academic study is beyond the popular understanding, and getting some of that more nuance that each of you are trying to do is a big challenge, isn't it? Getting a more nuanced understanding, which then allows people to take a piece. You know, in my teaching, I tell students right away that human rights is a structure. I use a book that talks about it as a structure, as a frame. And what can you do with that frame? There are limits. And I think it's really important, again, to parse things as much as we can. It's hard, but I really think it's important.
Thank you so much. So I think here might be a good time to wrap up today's event. So again, thank you to all of our panelists for such incredible presentations and for sharing about your research and what you're doing since graduating from the program. I know, I'll speak just from Zorian, but I know, Joyce, you feel the same way, that it's just so nice and so rewarding seeing our students graduate and go on to do incredible things. I'm so fortunate to have stayed in touch with all of you. And a big thank you to Professor Apsel as well for moderating this wonderful discussion, and to the participants for joining today. If you do have any questions after this conversation, feel free to email the Institute, and we'd be happy to kind of address some of these questions or reach out to the panelists. And before we sign off today, a reminder that the deadline to apply for the 2022 GHRUP is just around the corner. It's next week on Tuesday, May 31st. So if you have anyone in mind, any graduate level students in mind who you think could benefit from this program, or it could help them in their future studies or work, please send them our way. We can help them with the application process, I should say. So thank you, everyone, and be safe, be well, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Megan.
Take care.
Bye,
Thank you very
everybody.
much. Great to
Please
see everyone.
feel free to email me for a chat. I'd love to talk to any of you and all of you. Ciao.
Thank
Thank you. It was a
ciao.
pleasure.
Take care.